What's the craziest sacrifice a family member expected you to make for them? My brother Damien sat across from me at the hospital cafeteria table, holding up his phone to show me the test results, and said, "They're scheduling the transplant for 6 weeks from now. You're saving my life, Aaron." His hand was shaking just enough to seem genuine, and I reached across to squeeze his shoulder while my coffee went cold in front of me. I'd already been through 2 rounds of compatibility testing, signed a dozen consent forms, and met with the transplant coordinator 3 times to discuss the kidney donation process. My wife Nina had cried for an hour when I first told her I was doing this, not because she didn't support saving my brother's life, but because she was terrified something would go wrong during surgery. Damien had been diagnosed with kidney failure 8 months ago, and our entire family had rallied around him with fundraisers and prayer chains and a rotating schedule of people driving him to dialysis appointments. I was 26 years old, in perfect health, and the only family member who was a match after our parents, 2 other siblings, and 5 cousins had all tested negative. The surgeon had explained the risks clearly during my consultation, walking me through the 6-inch incision they'd make in my abdomen, the 6 weeks of recovery time, and the small possibility of complications. But I'd looked at my brother's face during that appointment, seen how gray his skin had become and how exhausted he looked, and I'd signed every form without hesitation because that's what family does. I'd been working as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing firm for 3 years, steadily building a career and saving money for the house Nina and I wanted to buy. We'd been married for 18 months and were planning to start trying for kids once we got settled in a bigger place. My boss had been understanding about the upcoming surgery, approving 6 weeks of medical leave and assuring me my position would be secure when I returned. Nina had started meal prepping and organizing our apartment to make my recovery easier, buying extra pillows for the couch and setting up a recovery station in our living room. My mother called every other day to thank me for stepping up and being the hero Damien needed, though I kept telling her I wasn't a hero, just a brother doing what needed to be done. Damien had always been the golden child in our family, the oldest son who'd gotten a business degree and worked in finance before his health crashed. He'd dated a string of beautiful women, driven expensive cars he couldn't really afford, and lived in a condo our parents had helped him buy. I'd always been the quieter younger brother, more practical and less flashy, but we'd been close growing up, and I couldn't imagine not helping him now when he needed me most. The first strange detail I noticed came 3 weeks before the scheduled surgery, when I stopped by Damien's condo to drop off groceries and found him loading golf clubs into his trunk. He looked startled when he saw me, quickly closing the trunk and explaining he was just organizing his storage unit while he still had energy. I asked if he felt strong enough to be doing that kind of physical activity, and he got defensive, saying the doctors wanted him staying active between dialysis sessions. Something about his tone felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid because I was nervous about the surgery. When I mentioned it to Nina that evening, she said kidney failure patients could have good days and bad days, and maybe this was one of his better days. I tried to let it go, but the image of those golf clubs kept nagging at me because the transplant coordinator had specifically said Damien should be conserving his energy and avoiding strenuous activities. 2 days later, I called his dialysis clinic to confirm his appointment schedule so I could coordinate visiting him, and the receptionist put me on hold for several minutes before coming back and saying she couldn't discuss patient information without authorization. I found that odd since I was listed as his emergency contact and had been to several appointments with him, but I assumed maybe there were new privacy policies I wasn't aware of. The second strange detail happened when I met with Dr. Ramona Keeley, the transplant surgeon, for my final preoperative consultation. She was a woman in her mid-50s with 30 years of experience and a reputation as one of the best transplant surgeons in the state. She walked me through the surgery timeline again and mentioned that Damien's kidney function had been fluctuating in recent tests, which sometimes happened with patients in his condition. I asked what that meant for the urgency of the transplant, and she paused before saying the medical team wanted to proceed as scheduled, but would be monitoring him closely. Something in her pause made my stomach tighten, and I asked directly if Damien was in immediate danger without the transplant. She said kidney failure was always serious, but his current dialysis regimen was keeping him stable for now, which struck me as different from what Damien had been telling the family about being in critical condition. When I mentioned this discrepancy to my mother that evening, she got upset and said I was looking for excuses to back out of helping my brother. She reminded me that doctors sometimes downplayed things to avoid scaring patients, and that Damien needed this transplant regardless of the exact timeline. I felt guilty for even questioning it and apologized for worrying her. The third strange detail came 2 weeks before surgery, when I ran into Damien's ex-girlfriend Cassidy at a coffee shop downtown. She asked how I was doing, and when I mentioned the upcoming transplant, her face went completely white. She pulled me aside and asked if I was absolutely sure Damien needed a kidney, because when they'd been dating 6 months ago, he'd been perfectly healthy and had never mentioned any kidney problems. I felt my chest tighten as I explained he'd been diagnosed 8 months ago, right around when they broke up, and she shook her head slowly. She said they'd dated for 2 years and broken up because Damien had been gambling heavily and lying about money, and she'd never seen him sick or going to any medical appointments. I told her maybe he'd hidden his health issues because he didn't want her to worry, but even as I said it, something felt wrong. She gave me her number and told me to call if I needed to talk, and I left that coffee shop with my hands shaking and my mind racing. When I confronted Damien about it that evening, he got furious and said Cassidy was a bitter ex who was trying to cause problems because she couldn't handle that he'd moved on. He said he hadn't told her about his kidney problems because their relationship was already falling apart, and he didn't want her pity. His explanation sounded reasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. The fourth strange detail happened when I was going through insurance paperwork 10 days before the surgery and noticed the dates on Damien's dialysis bills didn't match the schedule our mother had been posting in the family group chat. According to the bills, he'd only been to dialysis 6 times in the past 3 months, when he was supposedly going 3 times a week. I called the dialysis center directly and asked to speak with his care coordinator, and after some back and forth, a nurse named Patricia Volkov got on the phone and asked who I was. I explained I was his brother and scheduled kidney donor, and she went quiet for a long moment before saying she couldn't discuss his treatment without his authorization. I asked her directly if Damien was actually attending his dialysis appointments, and she said she really couldn't comment on that but suggested I speak with my brother about his treatment compliance. The way she said it made my stomach drop because it sounded like she was trying to tell me something without violating patient privacy. When I called Damien to ask about the missed appointments, he exploded at me, saying I was harassing his medical team and interfering with his treatment. He said he'd been feeling better lately, and his doctors had adjusted his schedule, which was why the bills looked different. My mother called me an hour later, crying and saying I was stressing Damien out when he was already dealing with so much, and I needed to stop interrogating him about his medical care. I couldn't sleep that night, lying next to Nina while she breathed softly, and my mind went in circles about all the inconsistencies I'd noticed. The golf clubs, the surgeon's careful wording, Cassidy's confusion, the missing dialysis appointments. I wanted to believe I was just being paranoid, that my anxiety about the surgery was making me see problems that weren't there. But something deep in my gut told me something was very wrong with Damien's story. Nina woke up around 2 o'clock in the morning and found me at the kitchen table with my laptop, scrolling through medical websites about kidney failure symptoms and dialysis requirements. She asked what I was doing, and I told her about all the strange things I'd noticed. She listened carefully and then said maybe I should postpone the surgery until I felt more confident about what was happening. I said I couldn't do that because the whole family was counting on me, and Damien would die if I backed out now. She pointed out that if Damien wasn't actually as sick as he claimed, then maybe he wouldn't die, and maybe I needed to find out the truth before letting someone cut me open and take my kidney. The next morning, I called Dr. Keeley's office and requested an appointment to discuss some concerns I had about the transplant. Her receptionist initially said there were no appointments available, but when I said I was the scheduled donor and needed to speak with her urgently, they found a slot that afternoon. I sat in her office at 3 o'clock, looking at her diplomas on the wall and the family photos on her desk, while I tried to figure out how to voice my suspicions without sounding crazy. She came in and sat down, asking what concerns I had, and I told her everything. The golf clubs, the missing dialysis appointments, the ex-girlfriend's confusion, the inconsistencies and timing. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying she appreciated me being honest about my concerns. She explained that as a surgeon, she had an ethical obligation to ensure all organ donations were given freely and without coercion, and that if I had any doubts, we should postpone until I felt certain. I asked her directly if Damien's kidney failure was real, and she said she couldn't discuss another patient's medical information with me, but that she'd be reviewing his file more carefully before proceeding with any surgery. I left that appointment feeling both relieved and terrified because I'd just put the transplant in jeopardy based on what might be paranoid suspicions. My phone started ringing within an hour, and it was my mother, absolutely hysterical. Damien had called her and told her I was trying to back out of donating, and she was begging me to reconsider, saying I was killing my own brother by questioning his doctors. I tried to explain about the inconsistencies I'd noticed, but she talked over me, saying I was being selfish and cruel and breaking apart our family. My father called next, his voice cold and disappointed, saying he'd raised me better than to abandon family when they needed me most. My sister Bethany sent a long text about how I was traumatizing everyone and needed to stop causing drama when Damien was fighting for his life. Nina stood next to me while I took call after call, her hand on my back, and when I finally turned off my phone, I sat on our couch and cried because my entire family thought I was a monster for questioning whether my brother was actually dying. That evening, I made a decision that would either prove I was right or destroy my relationship with my family forever. I drove to the dialysis center where Damien supposedly received treatment and asked to speak with Patricia Volkov, the nurse I'd talked to on the phone. She came out to the waiting room and recognized my name immediately, leading me to a small office and closing the door. I told her I needed to know the truth about my brother's treatment because I was scheduled to donate my kidney in a week, and if there was something wrong, I needed to know before the surgery. She looked at me for a long moment, clearly wrestling with patient privacy rules and medical ethics, and finally said she couldn't tell me anything about Damien's care directly, but she could tell me about dialysis requirements in general for someone with his supposed level of kidney failure. She explained that patients with advanced kidney failure typically need dialysis 3 times a week. Missing more than a few appointments would result in dangerous toxin buildup. and patients in that condition show clear physical symptoms like severe fatigue, edema, and changes in mental clarity. She said that someone who was healthy enough to load golf clubs into a car trunk and argue on the phone for extended periods probably wasn't in end-stage kidney failure. I asked if she was saying Damien wasn't really sick, and she said she was saying I should ask his doctors for his most recent lab results and verify his diagnosis before proceeding with an irreversible surgery. I drove straight to the hospital where Dr. Keeley worked and demanded to see the most recent test results for Damien's kidney function. The administrative staff initially refused, citing privacy laws, but I explained I was the scheduled donor and had a right to know what I was donating for. After several hours and multiple phone calls between departments, a hospital attorney named Douglas Brennan came down to speak with me. He was a thin man in his 40s with graying hair and glasses, and he explained that while I couldn't legally access Damien's medical records without his consent, as a potential donor, I had the right to request an independent medical evaluation to verify the need for the transplant. He said the hospital's transplant ethics committee would need to review the situation, and he'd be scheduling an emergency meeting for the next morning. I asked what would happen at that meeting, and he said they'd examine all available evidence about Damien's condition and determine whether proceeding with the transplant was medically and ethically appropriate. He gave me his card and told me to be at the hospital at 9 o'clock the next morning. I barely slept that night, and when I walked into the conference room at 9 o'clock, there were 7 people sitting around the table. Dr. Keeley was there, along with Douglas Brennan, a hospital administrator named Carol Nguyen, a medical ethicist named Dr. James Richter, who specialized in transplant cases, Patricia Volkov from the dialysis center, and 2 other doctors I didn't recognize. They asked me to explain my concerns in detail, and I went through everything again, showing them the dialysis bills with missing appointments, describing the golf club incident, mentioning Cassidy's confusion about Damien never being sick during their relationship. Dr. Richter asked if I had any proof beyond circumstantial observations, and I admitted I didn't, just a strong feeling that something was wrong. Carol Nguyen said they'd been reviewing Damien's medical records and had some concerns about inconsistencies in his testing timeline. Dr. Keeley added that she'd requested new lab work from Damien yesterday, and he'd become very agitated and refused to submit to additional testing, which was unusual for someone desperate for a transplant. Douglas Brennan explained that the hospital had a legal and ethical obligation to ensure organ donations were appropriate, and based on the concerns raised, they were suspending the transplant pending further investigation. The room erupted with discussion about how to proceed, and I sat there feeling both vindicated and horrified, because if I was right, it meant my brother had been lying about dying for months. Dr. Richter said they needed to conduct an independent medical evaluation of Damien's kidney function with tests done under controlled conditions to prevent any possibility of manipulation. Patricia Volkov mentioned that in her 15 years as a dialysis nurse, she'd seen a handful of cases where patients faked or exaggerated kidney problems for various reasons, usually related to seeking pain medication or disability benefits. She said the pattern of missed appointments and vague symptoms fit that profile, and if Damien was avoiding regular dialysis, it suggested he didn't actually need it. One of the other doctors, who introduced himself as Dr. Philip Wong, the hospital's nephrology department head, said he'd review Damien's original diagnosis paperwork and compare it with standard protocols for kidney failure diagnosis. The meeting concluded with everyone agreeing to demand new comprehensive testing from Damien before any transplant could proceed, and if he refused, the surgery would be canceled permanently. I called Damien as I left the hospital and told him the transplant was on hold pending new tests. He went ballistic on the phone, screaming that I'd betrayed him and turned the doctors against him when he was dying. I said if he was really dying, then the tests would prove it, and we'd proceed with the surgery immediately. He said I'd poisoned everyone's mind with my paranoid accusations, and now he'd probably die before they finished their investigation. I asked him directly why he'd refused to submit to new lab work the day before, and he said he was tired of being treated like a criminal when he was the victim. The call ended with him yelling that I'd killed him, and he hoped I could live with that guilt. My mother called me within minutes, sobbing that I'd destroyed Damien's chance at survival and torn apart our family. She said the hospital had called to tell her the transplant was canceled, and she wanted me to know I'd never be forgiven for this. My father left a voicemail saying I was no longer welcome at family gatherings until I made this right. Bethany sent a text calling me a psychopath who was obsessed with destroying Damien's life. Nina held me while I cried, saying I'd done the right thing and the truth would come out. Dr. Wong called me 3 days later and asked me to come to his office for a meeting. I walked in to find him sitting with Dr. Keeley, Douglas Brennan, and a woman who introduced herself as Detective Rita Kwan from the Insurance Fraud Division. My hands went cold because the presence of a detective meant this had escalated beyond a medical ethics issue into a potential crime. Detective Kwan was in her early 40s with 15 years of experience investigating healthcare fraud, and she explained that several red flags in Damien's case had triggered an automatic review by the insurance company. She said they'd subpoenaed his medical records and discovered significant inconsistencies between the diagnosis he'd reported and the actual test results on file. Dr. Wong pulled out a folder full of lab reports and explained that Damien's kidney function, while slightly below normal, was nowhere near the level that would require dialysis or transplant. He said the original diagnosis of kidney failure appeared to have been based on manipulated lab results that didn't match the actual blood draws. Detective Kwan said they were investigating how the manipulation happened, but early evidence suggested Damien had either tampered with samples or convinced someone at a testing facility to falsify results in exchange for payment. I sat there feeling like I couldn't breathe while Dr. Wong explained that Damien's actual kidney function was at about 70%, which was low but manageable with diet and medication. He said there was no medical need for a transplant, and in fact, performing the surgery would have subjected me to unnecessary risk for no benefit to Damien's health. Dr. Keeley said she was deeply disturbed that the fraud had gotten this far through their screening process, and they were reviewing all their protocols to prevent this from happening again. Douglas Brennan explained that the hospital would be filing a formal complaint with medical licensing boards and cooperating fully with the criminal investigation. Detective Kwan asked if I'd be willing to provide a statement about Damien's behavior and the inconsistencies I'd noticed, and I said yes, without hesitation. She explained that insurance fraud was a serious crime, and if they could prove Damien had deliberately faked his condition to obtain an unnecessary transplant, he could face multiple felony charges with potential prison time. I asked why he would do this if he didn't actually need the kidney, and she said they were still investigating his motives, but it appeared to involve financial incentives from selling organs on the black market. My stomach turned as Detective Kwan explained that there was a thriving illegal market for human organs, with kidneys selling for upwards of $100,000 to desperate patients who couldn't get legitimate transplants. She said they'd found evidence that Damien had been in contact with several brokers who facilitated these sales, and it appeared he'd planned to receive my kidney through the legitimate medical system, then sell it to a buyer overseas, rather than actually using it himself. The scheme would have required additional surgery to remove the kidney after transplant, which would have been performed by unlicensed doctors in another country. She said this type of fraud was rare, but not unheard of, usually motivated by severe financial problems or addiction issues. I told her about Cassidy mentioning gambling problems, and Detective Kwan wrote that down, saying they'd found evidence of significant gambling debts totaling over $200,000 that Damien owed to several casinos and private lenders. The kidney sale would have cleared his debts and provided additional profit, all while I recovered from major surgery, believing I'd saved my brother's life. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, legal consultations, and family implosion. Detective Kwan brought me in for a formal recorded statement, where I detailed every interaction with Damien, every inconsistency I'd noticed, and every moment I doubted his story. She said my testimony would be crucial for the prosecution because I could establish the pattern of lies and manipulation from a family member's perspective. A prosecutor named Leonard Shaw contacted me to discuss the case, explaining that Damien would likely be charged with insurance fraud, attempted theft by deception, and conspiracy to commit organ trafficking. He said the organ trafficking charge was federal and carried a sentence of up to 10 years in prison. My family group chat exploded with messages accusing me of going to the police and trying to send Damien to prison when he was sick and vulnerable. My mother called every day begging me to drop the charges and stop cooperating with investigators, saying I was destroying my own brother over a misunderstanding. I tried to explain that Damien wasn't actually sick and had been planning to sell my kidney, but she refused to believe it, saying the police were lying to turn me against my family. The breaking point came when Dr. Wong held a press conference at the hospital to announce they'd uncovered an organ fraud scheme involving falsified medical records. He didn't name Damien specifically due to legal restrictions, but he described the case details and explained how close they'd come to performing an unnecessary surgery. Local news outlets picked up the story, and within hours, reporters were calling my phone and showing up at my apartment building. One journalist, a woman named Michelle Torres, who specialized in medical fraud investigations, convinced me to give an on-the-record interview about my experience. I sat in front of her camera and told the whole story, from agreeing to donate my kidney to discovering the truth to watching my family turn against me for exposing the fraud. The interview aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news, and within an hour, my phone was flooded with messages from family members calling me a traitor and attention seeker who'd humiliated the family on television. But I also received messages from dozens of strangers thanking me for exposing the fraud and sharing their own stories of family members who'd tried to manipulate them into dangerous medical procedures. Damien was arrested 4 days later at his condo. Detective Kwan called to tell me they'd executed a search warrant and found extensive evidence of the organ trafficking scheme, including emails with brokers, wire transfer records showing planned payments, and medical documents from overseas facilities. She said Damien had lawyered up immediately and wasn't cooperating with investigators, but they had enough evidence to proceed without his confession. His bail was set at $50,000, and my parents immediately took out a second mortgage to pay it. I received a letter from my mother the day after his release, formally disowning me and saying I was no longer part of the family. She said I'd chosen law enforcement over my own blood and would have to live with that decision. My father's letter was shorter but colder, simply stating that he had one less son as of that day. Bethany called to say she never wanted to see me again and hoped I was happy destroying everyone's lives. The only family member who reached out with support was my cousin Nathan, who'd tested negative as a donor early on, and he admitted he'd always thought something was off about Damien's story, but hadn't wanted to be the one to say it. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Damien's attorney tried every possible defense, from claiming the lab results were legitimate but misinterpreted to suggesting I'd fabricated evidence because of sibling rivalry. Leonard Shaw, the prosecutor, systematically dismantled each argument with documentation, expert testimony, and the financial paper trail showing planned organ sale. Dr. Wong testified about the medical impossibility of Damien's claimed condition, matching his actual test results. Detective Kwan presented evidence of Damien's communications with black market organ brokers. Patricia Volkov testified about his pattern of missed dialysis appointments and lack of symptoms consistent with kidney failure. I testified for 3 hours about the timeline of events, the pressure from family to go through with the surgery, and the moment I'd realized something was wrong. Damien's attorney tried to portray me as a vindictive brother seeking attention, but Leonard Shaw entered into evidence the text messages and emails where Damien had explicitly thanked me for agreeing to donate and expressed urgency about the surgery timeline. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and throughout it, my parents and Bethany sat in the courtroom glaring at me while I sat on the prosecutor's side. Nina came with me every single day, holding my hand when I testified and refusing to let me face this alone. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Damien was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after 5 years. The judge called his actions a profound betrayal of family trust and medical ethics, saying he'd not only put me at risk, but undermined public confidence in the organ donation system. My mother screamed in the courtroom when the sentence was announced, and my father had to be escorted out by security when he tried to approach me in the hallway. Bethany posted a long rant on social media about how the justice system had ruined an innocent man's life, and our extended family split down the middle between those who believed Damien had been wrongly convicted and those who thought he deserved worse. In the months after the trial, I struggled with depression and guilt, despite knowing I'd done the right thing. Nina encouraged me to start seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Vivian Sato, who specialized in family trauma and betrayal. She helped me understand that my grief wasn't just about losing my brother, but about losing the family I'd believed I had, the parents who should have protected me from being manipulated into unnecessary surgery, and the siblings who should have supported me when I questioned the situation. She said family scapegoating was common in cases like mine, where one person's exposure of dysfunction threatened the family's collective denial. I attended sessions twice a week for 6 months, slowly learning to process what had happened and rebuild my sense of self-worth without my family's validation. Dr. Sato connected me with a support group for people who'd been cut off from families after exposing abuse or fraud, and hearing other people's stories made me feel less alone. The hospital implemented new protocols as a result of my case, requiring independent verification of all organ donor requests and mandatory ethics reviews when family members expressed concerns. Dr. Keeley published a paper in a medical ethics journal about my case, with my permission and anonymizing details, arguing for stronger safeguards against coerced or fraudulent organ donations. Detective Kwan told me they'd uncovered 3 other potential cases where Damien had attempted similar schemes with people outside the family, and my testimony had been crucial in pursuing those investigations. Michelle Torres, the journalist who'd interviewed me, won an award for her investigative series on organ trafficking that had grown out of covering my story. I received emails from medical students and ethics professors asking if I'd be willing to speak about my experience, and I started doing occasional guest lectures about the importance of questioning authority, even when it's family. Nina and I moved to a different city 8 months after the trial, needing distance from the constant reminders and judgment from people who'd seen the news coverage. We bought a small house with a yard, and I found a new engineering job that paid slightly better than my previous position. We started trying for kids, and when Nina got pregnant, we made a mutual decision not to tell any of my blood relatives. Our daughter was born on a Saturday morning in March, and the only family present were Nina's parents and siblings who'd supported us throughout the whole ordeal. I held my daughter and thought about how I'd almost let Damien take my kidney, how I'd almost prioritized family pressure over my own instincts, and how different everything would be if I'd gone through with that surgery. The scar I didn't have became a reminder of the bullet I'd dodged and the price of questioning people who demand blind loyalty. I heard through Nathan that Damien was up for parole after serving 4 years. The parole board denied his request after reviewing his complete lack of remorse and continued insistence that he'd been wrongly convicted. My mother tried to contact me through Nathan, saying she wanted to reconcile now that enough time had passed. I read her message and deleted it without responding because reconciliation would require her acknowledging what Damien had tried to do to me, and Nathan said she still maintained his innocence. My father had health problems and was in and out of the hospital, and Bethany apparently thought I should set aside our differences to be there for him. I felt a flicker of guilt, then remembered sitting in that cafeteria while Damien showed me fake test results and manipulated me into agreeing to major surgery so he could sell my kidney and pay off gambling debts. Some betrayals don't get second chances. Dr. Sato told me in one of our last sessions that forgiveness wasn't about the other person deserving it, but about freeing myself from the weight of anger. I said I'd work on forgiving them for my own peace, but that didn't mean restoring relationships with people who'd pressured me to ignore my instincts and sacrifice my health for a lie. She said that was perfectly healthy boundary setting, and I didn't owe anyone access to my life just because we shared DNA. I left that session feeling lighter than I had in months. Nina and I took our daughter to the park that afternoon, and I pushed her on the baby swings while she giggled and reached for the sky. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and I almost ignored it, but something made me check. It was from Cassidy, Damien's ex-girlfriend, saying she'd followed the case in the news and wanted me to know she was proud of me for trusting my gut and preventing him from hurting anyone else. She said she'd spent years doubting herself about whether his gambling and lying had been as bad as she remembered, and my investigation had validated everything she'd tried to warn people about. I wrote back thanking her, and we ended up meeting for coffee the following week, where she shared more details about Damien's history of manipulation and financial schemes that she'd been too embarrassed to report at the time. 3 years after the trial, I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Damien had listed me as next of kin for medical emergencies, and they were notifying me that he'd been diagnosed with early-stage kidney disease, likely caused by years of drug use and poor health management in prison. The irony was almost too perfect to process. The brother who'd faked kidney failure to manipulate me into donating now actually had kidney problems and would eventually need the dialysis he'd pretended to need before. The letter asked if I'd be willing to be contacted for testing as a potential donor if his condition deteriorated to transplant need. I read that letter 3 times, feeling a complicated mix of schadenfreude, pity, and absolute certainty about my answer. I wrote back declining to be considered as a donor and requesting removal from his emergency contact list. Nina read my response before I sealed the envelope and asked if I was sure. I said I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Some sacrifices aren't noble. They're just enabling people who've proven they'll hurt you given the chance. If you made it this far, you understand why I couldn't give my brother my kidney. Not because he didn't deserve help, but because helping him would have required believing his lies and ignoring every instinct that told me something was wrong. The craziest sacrifice my family expected me to make wasn't donating an organ to save a life. It was surrendering my body, my health, and my future to maintain their collective denial about who Damien really was. I chose to protect myself instead, and that choice cost me my parents, one of my siblings, and the family identity I'd built my life around. But it saved me from exploitation that would have left physical and emotional scars no amount of family approval could heal. Sometimes the hardest sacrifice is refusing to sacrifice yourself, standing firm when everyone you love demands you ignore what you know to be true. I made that choice, and I'd make it again. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.